Alessandro is an author of a number of books on intelligence matters. I first met Alessandro in Boston when he was giving a lecture at the American History Center in Hudson, Massachusetts, which is a kind of a military history living military history museum. In fact, as I drove up that day, an Abrams tank was maneuvering outside of the museum or something like that, which was a sight. And he was giving his lecture underneath the wing of a B-24 bomber and across from a Scud missile, which was like one of the coolest places to give a speech I think you could ever give one. Now we take up this book because I'm grateful to him for speaking in connection to my class at Marquette, Religion and Espionage, where we talk about precisely these matters. So my first question, Alessandro, about your very engaging book and informative book and really wonderful book is these Fightìng Fathers. As you mentioned in your first chapter, Catholics were only 7% of the population of Vietnam in the late 50s, early 60s. So could you tell us, did these, as you call them, Fightìng Fathers, did they have, what kind of influence did they have? Who were they? And why are they worthy of our attention? And what kind of traction and influence did they have in Vietnamese society during the war and their connectivity to the CIA?
Okay. Well, the Fightìng Fathers, as they were called also informally within the CIA, were active, at least at the beginning of their activity, late 50s, early 60s, in a country where the dominating clan, the ruling family, the Ngo family, was Catholic. And this, combined with the legacy of the French colonial rule, granted the Catholic minority some privileges. Although even in the Diem era, Diem was the president, de facto dictator of South Vietnam, even in the Diem era, the supply of weaponry to those communities was not immediate and very prudent. There is in the book, there is a map that shows the points in which the Fightìng Fathers program was being implemented by the CIA. Those two characters which I focused on in my book have been focused on for specific reasons, which I will mention in a minute. Let's say that why the CIA, which brings us back to espionage and religion. As many of you know, back in those years, the CIA was given the task of conducting and performing those paramilitary actions. It all, most of it changed after '63 when with the operation Switchback. Such paramilitary operations on a large scale were handed over to the military, to the Pentagon. But back then, it was the CIA who was managing and organizing these activities. The reason why I focused my research on those specific two characters is very simple. Those are the only ones that I could, on which I could give a name, a face, a profile, and a complete picture of their activity. Let's go back maybe to some of your students about the motivation behind my research in this case, as it was in the previous book about the Norwegian mercenaries in Vietnam. The events or the cases that seem unreal. Now, this thing of the Fightìng Fathers was meant to be, by the CIA in the very beginning at least, as a sort of stay-behind operation. So the build-up of an infrastructure, communication, resistance deposits in case of a violent communist takeover, as it was in Europe with the stay-behind operation in all various Western countries. But before too long in Vietnam, it switched to a more offensive operation, offensive patrolling, self-defense, armed self-defense of the villages, and or at least of those, not only of the Catholic minority, but specifically in the Catholic minorities. And one of the reasons that led me to research was that in the very, very few writings or testimonies about that was said, there were those fighting fathers, but the most famous was a certain father or brother Bosco. And none of those authors who mentioned this most famous was able to give, here we see, the only picture that I know existing in the world, which is the picture in the front cover of my book, that shows Brother Bosco. You see in full black cassock of those years. I will say a word about this picture itself. And I said, hey, Bosco, Vietnam was one of the wars in which Italy didn't enter at all, even with the, not even with the field military hospital that we sent to Korea, not even that in Vietnam. So I said, hey, maybe we were there with a missionary, with a fighting priest. And there it began my research. The 2 or 3 authors which mentioned this, I could contact directly. I asked the question, you say, you wrote, but the most famous was Brother Bosco. Any reason why you say that was the most famous other than citing his name? And the answer was no. So probably it was all copy and paste or just hearsay. So I said, okay, let's contact former Italian missionaries who were there in those years. Contacted a couple of them. And one of them, especially Father Geddo, was very precious for a book he gave me. And both of them said, look, San Giovanni Bosco, is a very popular saint all over the Catholic minorities in Southeast Asia. So the fact that this man was called, this priest was called Bosco, is not a proof that he was Italian. It's very common that they call Bosco their son, or that a priest, once he's ordained priest, assumes the name Bosco. So this is probably the proof that he's a Vietnamese and not an Italian. When I finally contacted Jack Benefield, who was the CIA case officer in charge of those operations in that area, he told me, hey, your Italian friend, the missionary, was 100% right. Brother Bosco, here it is, was 100% pure-breed Vietnamese. And I said, look, but these neatly dressed soldiers around him don't exactly look like ragtag peasants, guerrillas. I said, no, they are the province chief, South Vietnamese province chief and his staff. And here we're back to something that Professor Gallagher and I discussed when we met in person in Hudson, Massachusetts, a couple of years ago. They had to be in the forefront. So Jack Benefield told me, we couldn't arm these peasants too well. We couldn't train them too well as we could, because otherwise the South Vietnamese official side would kick us out because we were somehow stealing the show. And that was one of the other keys, angles to look at the Vietnam War. So the other character was...
do you buy that explanation? I mean, do you believe that? That sounds kind of like nonsense to me.
It is, but I know, for example, of an Australian advisor who was very successful in his own village of his own responsibility, and he was told off. He said, Jack Benefield told me, we always had to be very much on the background. The South Vietnamese officials said, they were very jealous of their responsibility and all. You can draw your own conclusions, but that does not surprise me. That does not surprise me, because after all, Saigon, the Saigon official side always looked with some suspect to those religious and ethnical minorities, seeing them as a potential threat to the central power or for cultural reasons. So there was this mutual mistrust. It is true that in those early years, Diem was in power. Diem was a Catholic, and that when these programs, for example, of the Fightìng Fathers, had the most continuous flow of supplies and support from the central authorities, but still with the CIA in the background, because they were in charge of these, let's say, unofficial operations. The other guy,
if I could interject, so this is Father Bosco. This is a Father Hoa, who I'll ask you to talk about later. But I think for our students, for the students and the folks on this call, I think there are a couple larger questions here. These are priests. I mean, this Father Bosco is dressed in a cassock, wearing a beret, probably French colonial influence there, but he's wearing a cross, a pectoral cross for some reason. He might even be a bishop or another rank of protonotary apostolic. And this is a Father Hoa who's actually carrying a shotgun, not military grade, but civilian grade shotgun. So the question is, like, the Council of Nicaea in 325 forbade priests to take up arms on the battlefield. On top of that, and more important still, you've got the Gospels talking about the law of love. You've got the example of Jesus healing the servant Malchus in the Garden of Gethsemane after his apostles took his ear off with a sword. You've got 2,000 years of Catholic pacifism, and then we show up in Vietnam, and the title of your book can legitimately be called The Fightìng Fathers. Now, I should tell the folks on the call, this book only looks at 2 priests, but after reading the book, these 2 priests were thoroughly involved with operational matters and of a military style in their home areas. I mean, it's extraordinary. So, like, how do you, in your writing of this book, how did you ever ask questions about how are these priests reconciling this military activity, which you can't really call it anything else?
Yeah, let's say that for what concerns Brother Bosco, he was an oblate of St. Joseph, if I remember well. He, according to Jack Benefield, he said he was very protective with his parishioners. He wanted the best for them, etc. But as far as I know, well, I don't have any other picture, but I never heard or saw or heard of him leading patrols with a gun in his hand. For Father Hoa, it was different for one very simple reason. He was a priest. He was ordained priest in 1935. But when the war between China and Japan broke out in 1937, of course, in the Chinese army, China is not a country where there is a tradition of a monotheistic religion. So he was a male, aged for military. He had a superior education. He had to be an officer. So that's where he got a military formation, a military training, and where he also matured his anti-communism, because also against the Japanese, there was already this radical division between the Kuomintang, the nationalist part of China, and the communists of Mao Zedong. So when the war ended and he was discharged, he returned to be a priest, and he was sent to the very same area.
You should let the viewers know he was discharged as a lieutenant colonel.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, he
made some career.
So he joined the enlisted corps, and they immediately saw that he was educated. I mean, he seems like a brilliant guy. Now, my take on his career, this is just a sidebar. I'm also, truth be told, I'm a Catholic priest. I'm a Jesuit priest, so I kind of know the church culture a little bit. And to my mind, he was slated to be a theology professor at a seminary. But then somewhere along the line, before he was able to go get his PhD, he must have ticked somebody off in the church, because as his star was rising, somebody clipped it, because as World War II broke out, he should have been either sent to Rome or the Pontifical Theologate in Manila to get his theological degree, but that never happened. And then he spent, gosh, how many years was it? Like 10 years in the Chinese Nationalist Army?
Something, yeah.
And he becomes this high-ranking officer. Like, he leads troops somehow he like dropped out of the church for 10 years and became a soldier, which to my mind means, what is his vocation looking like? Does he think of himself as a priest, or does he think of himself as a soldier? Because he retires or he gets discharged as a lieutenant colonel.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, from this point of view, probably, as far as I know, he's a one of a kind. We have to say that in some short clips, not pictures, but 8mm camera films that was shot with him in action, I tend to think he was grabbing his 16 shotgun. Although I have the feeling that he used it more to hunt hawks, which were perceived as a threat to the poultry of his village, rather than shooting at human people. But that doesn't really change what you said, which is absolutely right. Hey, what is your vocation? If you look at a movie like Mission, you see Robert De Niro and Jeremy Irons playing the two opposite. Help them, but as a priest, not as a soldier. While Robert De Niro says, the only way I can help them against these soldiers is protecting also with my military skills. Now, both of them, at least some of them, asked official permission to the local hierarchy. Are we allowed to such activities? And they didn't have an answer, neither yes or no, because of course, although we have to keep in mind that the Archbishop of Hue was the elder brother of Diem, so the highest Catholic authority of Vietnam was part of the family ruling Vietnam, so part of that, let's say, disputable kind of ruling of the country. But they didn't say yes. They didn't even say no, because they acknowledged that the military expertise or the dedication of these priests was the only way these peasants could be helped. Whether it was a wise decision or not, I don't know.